Zach.
I'm Caroline.
And we're going to talk about climate change. Climate change does not only have major implications for the environment, but people as well. 140 million people to be exact are going to be so affected by climate change that they will literally have to leave their homes because they can no longer live there. This is going to cause the biggest wave of migration the world has ever seen. In this video, we're going to focus on one specific region of the world, Central America, and the implications that climate change has on its people. The poorest people in Central America will be forced to move due to many slowly onsetting climate change impacts, including rising temperatures, which are expected to rise by upwards of 2 degrees by 2050, and water availability, which is expected to decrease by upwards of 83% by 2050. And these two factors will cause a 50% decrease of crop yields by 2050, which will cause a massive shortage of food within Central America. So because of these horrible living conditions and this lack of food, millions of people are going to have to move from rural areas into cities. So these urban migration hotspots are going to need to prepare for this incoming influx of people. And if urbanization occurs really quickly and really unsustainably, which is likely, then entire cities could dissolve into slums, basically, with horrible and dangerous living conditions. So we're kind of in between a rock and a hard place here, because if cities in Central America are becoming too dangerous for people to live in, and rural areas are becoming too unsafe due to climate change, then where can these people go? They're essentially climate refugees.
Approximately 265 million people have been displaced by natural disasters since 2008. They are then environmental migrants or climate refugees, which are defined as groups of people who are forced to leave their homes as a result of climate change. This relocation may be permanent or temporary in their home country or abroad. Currently, international refugee law does not include any provisions for climate refugees. No court has ever offered protection based off of international refugee law to a climate migrant. There have been several instances in which international organizations have provided for climate migrants. The 1969 Organization of African Unity Convention, for example, granted asylum to Somalian refugees fleeing drought. The first multilateral framework, which expanded migration options, was the Global Compact on Migration, which offers limited and conventional migration services towards migrants. Climate migrants need more hands-on support that assists their resettlement process.
So let's take a break here for a second. So I have a question for Caroline. Caroline, what countries are actually responsible for climate change and thus the impending climate refugee crisis?
The United States and other wealthy nations.
Okay, I was hoping you'd say that, because should it then be the responsibility of these wealthy nations to help the problem they created? I mean, you know, in the context of the US and Central America, should the US relieve pressures on Central America by opening its borders and allowing migrants to come in? Or should they seal themselves off, leaving millions of people in increasingly unlivable places?
As a driver of climate change, the United States should expand its refugee policy and add provisions for climate migrants seeking asylum. While this is a moral responsibility of the US, bipartisan support surrounding the climate refugee crisis will most likely be unattainable. The US has historically shown interest towards divesting its responsibility as a powerful country by investing in capacity-building programs in crisis-ridden countries. This introduces two conflicting perspectives with regards to the US admitting climate refugees, the idealistic and realistic points of view.
So, I'm an optimist. What can I say? I like thinking idealistically, and I'm going to present the idealistic point of view on this whole climate refugee situation in Central America. We just established that developed nations, especially the US, should accept climate migrants, as these countries are responsible for climate change in the first place. So there are several points that I would like to make on how wealthy nations can go about trying to mitigate this climate refugee crisis. So firstly, wealthy nations need to redirect their development assistance to incorporate today's unfolding climate crisis. So this means more funds will need to be directed to organizations such as the Green Climate Fund, the UNHCR, and the International Red Cross or Red Crescent organization. Secondly, these developed nations can invest more money in the nations that are actually being affected by climate change. So this means investing in green energy for these nations. This means investing in irrigation systems and water supply networks that will function despite less rainfall. Wealthy nations also need to coordinate amongst themselves through their development agencies on how they will fund these less economically privileged nations. And there's one more solution I would like to point out to address the climate refugee crisis, and these are the solution is FMAs, or free movement agreements. Free movement agreements would be very useful to help solve this crisis because they can serve as a framework to help support these refugees despite the absence of legal measures to protect these climate refugees. They also can be tailored to a region's specific needs, and it requires fewer countries to buy in and sign, rather than having all 195 nation states in the world signing this one agreement. These FMAs can serve as a more consolidated version of that. They also sidestep the necessity of determining whether the movement was forced or voluntary, because it just allows the free movement of people amongst these countries that sign this FMA. Yeah, so that was my point of view on this whole subject. As I said, I'm an optimist, and I do believe that these developed nations should really take the initiative to help solve the problem they created. But unfortunately, this isn't always the reality, and we're not living in a very optimistic world at the moment. So I'm going to pass it on to Caroline, who's going to be a little bit more realistic than me.
I'm back, and I'm a little bit more realistic than Zach on this one. U.S. refugee policy has grown increasingly conservative in recent years. A toxic rise in American nationalism and an increase in hate crimes within the last 4 years produces an unwelcome environment for climate migrants and other refugees in the United States. This harsh environment is fueled by conservative ideology and those in power. The realistic perspective could support either the temporary admittance of climate migrants or the complete refusal of them. We have employed the ideologies of several professors to help illustrate our claim. Professor David Miller writes about the temporary acceptance of refugees. To preserve American nationalism, the U.S. may temporarily accept refugees until the humanitarian crisis has subsided, while ensuring that American citizens have priority to rights that include employment opportunities, the best insurance, and all the while putting America first. Temporary accepting refugees will save American taxpayers. He asserts that it would be within the United States' best interest to discourage long-distance migration by sending aid and helping to expand holding capacity in refugees' home countries by investing in them. This shifts the responsibility of the United States, of the wealthier, more powerful nation that it is, to the troubled country that is dealing with a climate crisis. Another professor, Garrett Hardin, asserts that powerful nations such as the United States have limited capacity, and that allowing climate migrants entry would upset the power dynamic that is already in place in the US. Conservatives like him support donating technology and donating money to underdeveloped or other affected countries so that they may organize their own solution. Under President Trump, American refugee policy has grown a lot more strict and a lot more conservative. Specifically, his Remain in Mexico policy has returned 47,000 asylum seekers from countries including Nicaragua and Venezuela to other cities in northern Mexico that are troubled themselves. In 2016, the Department of State reported that the resettlement process takes an average of 18 to 24 months to complete. This process is made to be slow so that migrants are systematically turned away. More specifically, immigration court dates are planned so that many asylum seekers cannot afford to wait. When appointments are missed, asylum seekers are deported for being absent and then are barred asylum or unification with family members already in the US. Under the Trump administration, foreign policy has aided Central American governments that cannot support their own people during this time in preventing their respective populations from migrating. In January of 2017, Trump suspended the US refugee admissions program for around 120 days. Since then, admissions have declined dramatically. In 2018, the refugee ceiling was set at 110,000 by the Obama administration, but was lowered to 45,000 in 2018. That number was reduced to 30,000 in 2019. As for free movement agreements, their multilateral agreement proves difficult. This is due to conflicting interests surrounding national security concerns in home and host countries, and this just makes the readaptation of FMAs, the climate-induced migration crisis, a big obstacle that has been overlooked and has not been overcome. All the previously mentioned points make the reality of a large admittance of climate refugees very unlikely.
So we had all this talk about the optimistic point of view, the realistic point of view, but fundamentally I think the livelihood really of these climate refugees from Central America is going to be decided in the next month with the next US presidential elections. If Biden wins, hopefully there'll be a concerted effort to admit refugees affected by climate change, increase funding to migration hotspots in Central America, to consult with affected countries on how to reach sustainable urbanization. Hopefully there'll be investments in green infrastructure to help mitigate the impacts of climate change on those most affected. And hopefully there'll be the redirection of funds to appropriate organizations such as the Green Climate Fund, the UNHCR, and the Red Cross. However, there's always the possibility that Trump will win again for 4 more years. And if this is the case, I think the livelihoods of climate refugees will be profoundly and gravely affected by this. And the world will really have to make an even more concerted effort to now handle this Central American climate refugee crisis. Other developed countries will have to coordinate amongst themselves about how they can ensure that these climate refugees earn the protection they deserve. And hopefully, the world can adopt a legal framework that protects climate refugees from unfair treatment at the US border. Yeah.
The accepted definition of a conventional refugee and the criteria set forth is too narrow and cannot fully account for the influx of displaced peoples as a result of climate change. We need to extend this definition of a conventional refugee to those who are seeking a new home due to climate change. While the admittance of climate refugees or migrants in the United States is dependent on bipartisan agreement, which will most likely not be reached, we must continue to educate ourselves about the root of our discussion and the carrier of the climate migration crisis, climate change. Climate change is already here. Sea levels will continue to rise, pollution will get worse, and urban centers will become more overpopulated if we do not pass environmental legislation that addresses the major contributors of climate change.
And the world it's full of optimists, it's full of realists, it's full of Democrats, and it's full of Republicans, but all these labels that we give each other do not matter one bit in this big overlapping problem that is climate change.
Thank you so much for watching this video. We hope that it was informative and that you enjoyed watching it.
See ya.
The accepted definition of a conventional The accepted definition of a conventional refugee in the well, the admittance of climate migrants.
You talk too soon.